So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case, another two-parter. So this is the first part of a new two-part series. The titles of these videos just keep getting more and more insane, don't they? Today we're going to be talking about the infamous 3 guys, 1 hammer serial killer case from the Ukraine. These killers claimed 21 victims in 21 days. This was an incredibly fast-paced murder spree. I actually don't think they can really be classed as serial killers. Obviously, a lot of people call them serial killers when it comes to this case due to the amount of victims that they had. But the difference between a serial killer and, you know, someone that commits a massacre or a spree killing is the cooling off period. Serial killers have a cooling off period between each kill, whereas obviously 21 victims in 21 days, there's no cooling off period here, so I don't know whether this should be classed as a murder spree. Either way, 3 guys, 1 hammer. And this case is mainly characterised through the snuff films that the killers would make. They would record themselves on their phones, finding their victims and killing their victims, and then they would post these videos onto gore websites online, and this is where they got the nickname 3 guys, 1 hammer, which is a play on the words of the other infamous video for different reasons. 2 girls, 1 cup, and if you don't know what that is, trust me, you don't want to know. Now, before we get into this case, I just want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Word Farmscapes. Word Farmscapes is a super fun 5-star rated word game app that challenges your mind in an enjoyable and relaxing way. They have crossword puzzles, find the word games, Scrabble missions, and loads more different word challenges. And you can download Word Farmscapes for free using the link down below in the description, and if you do, you'll get a free welcome bonus. The animals on the farm need your help to rebuild, decorate, and customize the farm and save them from the evil forces lurking within. I personally love the design aspect of this game. I love that you can change like the brickwork and the colours and the flowers and like loads more. I love doing this like on a night in bed when you're just chilling. I think it's so relaxing. And did I mention that the game is totally ad-free as well, so there's no disruptions as you're playing, so what are you waiting for? And there's also a special offer on for this weekend only, all weekend. Play the winter quest to collect as many snowflakes as you can by completing crossword levels to win tons of amazing rewards. Don't miss this amazing opportunity to get bonus coins and win prizes. Become the hero of the farm now and download Word Farmscapes using the link down below in the video description, and you will get a free welcome bonus when you do. Thanks again to Word Farmscapes for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into the case, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. So today's case takes place in a city in the Ukraine which is now known as Dnipro. It was formerly known as Dnepropetrovsk, but I might call it Dnipro because I have stumbled over that word so many times. Dnipro is a pretty industrial area, and this case takes place in like the 2000s, so it's not too soon after they left the Soviet Union, but soon enough that they were still having some kind of financial effects at this time. Now, I don't know too much about the Ukraine and the Soviet Union and things like this. It all kind of hurt my brain to read about and make sense of, but I do believe that the country was struggling financially still at this time in 2007. Maybe not quite as bad as they were when they first left the Soviet Union. Back then there was a deep recession, hyperinflation, the poverty rate soared, unemployment rate soared, and it was a hard time in the Ukraine. But like I said, this case took place, you know, maybe a decade and a half after all of that, so I think it was a little bit better at this point. So the summer of 2007 was a nice time, you know, the nights were lighter, the weather was better, everyone was happy. But then on June 25th, 2007, the city of Dnipro was shaken up in a very serious way. 33-year-old university teacher Yekaterina Ilchenko was hosting a dinner that night at her home. Her mother was in attendance, so was her best friend. It wasn't anything too big, but Yekaterina was a very sociable woman. She loved to host and open up her home. And this night was no different. She spent the whole night talking and laughing and having a nice time with her mother and her best friend. She told them all about her recent trip to Turkey. Yekaterina was a very athletic person. She enjoyed sports. She was in a couple of local sports teams. She was very into traveling. She was just a very outgoing person. So this night was going really well. Everyone was having a wonderful time, and then towards the end of the night, Yekaterina's friend was ready to go home. She was slightly intoxicated, and so Yekaterina offered to walk her home so that her friend got home safe. Yekaterina asked her mother if she wanted to come and walk the friend home with her, but she was tired, and so the mother just went straight to bed. So the two women went without her. They got all the way to the friend's house. The friend said she got home safe, and she waved Yekaterina off as she walked back to her own apartment. However, around 4 a.m, Yekaterina's mother woke up back at home, and she said that she had this really awful feeling inside. It was like she didn't wake up for any particular reason. It was like something made her wake up. So she got up and something told her to go and check in Yekaterina's room, and when she did, she saw that her bed hadn't been touched. It hadn't been slept in. It was as if she'd taken her friend home and then never returned back to the apartment. So her mother, in a very panicked state, ran out into the street and began looking for Yekaterina. She was running up and down the streets, and when she got onto this one particular path, she noticed 3 women at the end, all huddled around something on the floor. They were pointing, they seemed rather panicked, and so she ran over to these women to see what was going on, and that was when she looked down on the ground and saw her own daughter, Yekaterina Ilchenko, laying dead in a pool of her own blood. She seemed to have large and brutal injuries to the head, which were later identified to have been done with a large, heavy, blunt object. She'd been beaten to death. Pathologists couldn't quite pinpoint what weapon had done this. Some people thought maybe it was a hammer, others thought maybe like a lead pipe. And these injuries on Yekaterina's face were actually so large and so destructive that her mother said that she didn't even have a face anymore. She just had like parts of a face. Her arms were actually lifted up by her head still when her body was found, suggesting that she was trying to protect herself right until the end. But this wasn't the only tragedy that the city would wake up to the following morning on June 26th. Just a couple of hours later, as the sun started coming up, another body was found, this time in a local park just a few hundred yards away from where Yekaterina's body was found. This time the victim was a 45-year-old man named Roman Tatovich. His body was found on a park bench in a very similar situation to Yekaterina's. His head was brutally beaten, so much so that his face was barely recognizable. And again, his arms were up around his head trying to protect himself. Now, because his face was so brutally beaten, police actually couldn't identify this man for a while until they had a homeless person come into the station and report their friend, Roman Tatovich, missing. Roman himself was homeless, and he would sleep on that park bench pretty much every night. And when this other guy hadn't seen his friend around the park for a while, and he'd heard that a murder had taken place on the exact bench where his friend slept every night, he knew that this had to have been Roman. So police got to work on these 2 very sudden, very serious murder cases that they were presented with, both in very close proximity to each other, literally around the corner, a couple of 100 yards away from each other. Both cases seemed identical. Both people were brutally beaten over the head, but what was odd was that they were such different victims. One was a middle-aged man, a middle-aged homeless man, and another one was a young woman walking home. These were not the same victim profile. Regardless, police knew that these kind of had to be linked. Obviously, due to how they were killed, where they were killed, it just didn't make sense that these were 2 separate murders. And if that didn't instill enough fear into the community, the thing that was the most scary about this was that there was no victim profile. It seemed as though this person that had killed these 2 people so far was targeting anyone. You know how a lot of serial killers will go for young women or young men or, you know, maybe the elderly or children? This didn't seem to be a pattern at all. So at first, police didn't really want to announce this to the city or to the community because, you know, it makes the town and the city look bad, which I don't think is a reason to keep this from people that live there and people that are now in danger. But regardless, the police didn't want it all over the news, so very local people knew. People knew through word of mouth, but there was nothing on the news, really. There were no big warnings saying stay at home, you know, this person's still on the loose, nothing like that. But people that were finding out about this were terrified because there was seemingly no motive either. Nothing had really been stolen from the two people. I mean, they attacked a homeless person. I don't know if this sounds awful, but they don't have anything to steal. That can't have been the motive. There was no sexual assault that was apparent on either of the bodies. It just seemed like there wasn't a motive. So really, it was only a matter of time until whoever had done this struck again. And the next attack came a lot sooner than everyone expected. It actually happened on the same night that those bodies were found. So the first two victims were killed in the middle of the night and the bodies were found the next morning, and then that evening another person was attacked. This time it was 58-year-old local man Viktor Pertsev, who was attacked very close to his own housing estate. So he was either just coming home or just leaving his home. Pertsev claims that he didn't see his attacker. His attacker came from behind and began hitting him over the head multiple times with a very heavy, blunt object. And Pertsev was lucky to get away with his life because at that exact moment, a woman across the street in a hair salon saw this happen, and she came outside, she started screaming and yelling at his attacker to leave him alone. The attacker ran away and Pertsev survived, although he sustained some very, very serious injuries. He was almost this person's third murder victim. Unfortunately, because he was attacked from behind, he couldn't tell police anything about his attacker, really. He never got a good look at them. The woman across the street didn't get a good look at them either because it was starting to get dark. She told them that she thought it was a man, but that really gives them nothing. The next development would come on July 1st, so 6 days after the last attack. That morning, the city woke up to find 2 more bodies in the streets, bringing the victim toll now up to 4. And these 2 bodies were identified as those of Yevgenia Grushenko and Nikolai Serchuk. Again, the exact same MO. The 2 of them sustained very serious head injuries that had been done with some kind of blunt, heavy object. Not much is known about these 2 particular murders. I couldn't find anything about the victims or about how their bodies were found, other than the fact that one of their skulls was split completely open. 5 days later, on July 7th, the city saw 4 more bodies discovered, seemingly all of them killed on the same murderous rampage through the night. The first of which was Igor Nechvoloda, a recently discharged army man. He was a young guy that enjoyed socialising. The night before this, the night that he was killed, he'd actually gone out with some friends. He was bar hopping, they were getting drunk, and then at the end of the night, he walked from the bar back to his apartment building. However, in the early hours of the morning, when his mother realised that he hadn't turned up home, she left the apartment, and it was actually her that found his body laying in the entrance to their apartment building. So he was almost home. He'd walked all the way there. And when his mother saw this, she screamed and woke up the whole neighbourhood. She said that his face was so disfigured that she couldn't even tell it was her son. She just knew. Again, the exact same MO. He seemed to have been hit multiple times over the head. The next body that was found that morning was 28-year-old single mother Yelena Sharam. Yelena was a security guard that worked the night shift, and she'd actually been working on the night that she was killed. However, she started not feeling very well during her shift and actually went home early. She would walk home every single time. It was about 4 blocks away from her house where she worked, and she'd gotten pretty much the whole way home when she was attacked and killed in the street. Again, this one was just around the corner from the last murder where Igor was killed. And Yelena was beaten probably the worst out of all of the victims so far. She had pretty much no skin left on her face. Her family actually said that when they came in to identify her body in the morgue, they looked at her and they just cried because they just couldn't. They couldn't identify that that was Yelena. No matter how much they felt like it was, or they knew it had to have been because she was missing, she wasn't answering calls, it didn't look like Yelena. It didn't look like anyone, so they couldn't identify her. She was actually only identified when her sister had asked the police what clothing this victim had been found wearing. Police showed her the clothes and immediately her sister recognised that as her work uniform. This was her sister. The third body that was found that day and the seventh murder victim overall was a woman named Valentina Hansa. Valentina was a mother of 3 and her husband, the father of those 3 children, was disabled to a point that he couldn't really care for them, and Valentina was the sole carer of all 3 of her children and her husband. So now that she wasn't there, it left her 3 young children and her husband without their carer. Again, she was beaten so savagely that she too was unrecognisable. And the last body found that morning was of a 14-year-old boy named Andrei Sidyuk. However, this time with Andrei Sidyuk, police actually had a huge lead in the case in the form of a survivor. Andrei hadn't been attacked alone. He'd actually been out with his best friend Vadim Lyakov that morning. The 2 of them had woken up early and they decided to cycle down to the local river and go fishing. Vadim said that it was actually supposed to be 3 of them out fishing that morning. However, the third boy that they were supposed to go with, his mother knew of all of these murders that had been going on up until this point, and she didn't feel comfortable with her son going out in the early hours of the morning because that was when most of these murders seem to have happened, during the night and the early hours of the morning. So the third friend ended up staying at home and it was just Vadim and Andrei. So that morning the 2 boys set off on their bikes and they started cycling down this country lane. It had trees and wooded areas either side of it. And Vadim says that as they were cycling, this green car sped past and overtook them and then stopped later down the road. So the boys were still cycling in that direction towards them. But as they were getting closer and closer, they noticed that 2 people had gotten out of this green car and they were just stood either side of it with their backs turned to the boys. As the boys cycled closer, they noticed that these 2 men that were facing away from them were holding something, like a large object each. However, by the point that he kind of had this fear set in, it was already too late because these 2 men had turned around and launched at them, both of them hitting each of the young boys with their weapons. The 2 boys were knocked off their bikes and onto the ground, and Vadim says that he actually managed to scramble to his feet, and when he did, he looked down at his friend Andrei and noticed that he was asleep. He wasn't responsive. It seemed as though he'd been knocked unconscious. And now Vadim's fight or flight set in and he knew that they would be in serious trouble if he stayed, and so he ran into the woods at the side of the road. Vadim ran through the woods to the side a little bit, so it wasn't like he ran deep into the woods, he ran a little bit in and then to the side because he knew that if the attackers came straight in and just went forwards, they would eventually catch him. So he tried to divert a little bit. He eventually found quite a large part of foliage that he could get himself under and hide, a place where he could actually see the road rather clearly. And he watched as the green car drove up and down this road multiple times over the next hour. And he was terrified, thinking that they were going to stop right in front of him and come and get him. Finally, when the car left, Vadim waited a few more minutes just to make sure that it wasn't going to come back, and when he thought that the coast was clear, he got out of the foliage and went back to where his friend was laying. Andrei was still laid in that exact spot in the road that Vadim had left him, and his head was covered in a horrific amount of blood. He was very severely beaten. However, Vadim noticed that his friend was still breathing, or struggling to breathe, but there was movement in his chest and he could tell that his friend was still alive, so he knelt down next to the body and he was talking to him. Vadim took off his shirt and used it to try to patch up the wounds on his friend's head as best as he possibly could. He took off his jacket as well and bundled that up and used it as a pillow for Andrei. Bear in mind, these are 2 14-year-old boys. Vadim had just watched as his friend got brutally beaten. He was chased after himself for an hour, and then when he goes back, his friend is dying and he's taking the clothes off his back to try to save his best friend. But he knew that he needed help. He knew that he needed an ambulance. He knew that he needed to get his friend to hospital as soon as possible because this was a race against time. So Vadim, without half of his clothes now, runs to the closest motorway that he can possibly get to and begins trying to flag down any cars that are going past. But at this point, it's still the early hours of the morning, so there weren't too many cars there, and a lot of the cars that were driving past weren't willing to stop for him. Eventually, one of them did pull over, but this 14-year-old boy is covered in blood. He's very frantic. Not a lot of people would stop for that, I don't think. This motorist that he did manage to flag down was willing to take him and Andre to hospital. However, by the time they all got there, Andre was pronounced dead on arrival. So police got to work on this specific murder case, and for some reason, they hadn't connected this one to the other ones. They didn't look at this one and think, exact same MO as all of the other, 7 murders. It was at the exact same time of night, in the early hours of the morning, in the exact same part of the city, but for some reason they didn't link it. Instead, police actually tried to pin this murder on poor 14-year-old Vadim. This boy had just been through the most traumatic thing in his whole life. He'd watched his friend be murdered. He was almost murdered himself. He had to go through the struggle of trying to keep his friend alive, trying to save his life, and ultimately failing. This was, the most trauma a person can really take. And now police are trying to blame him for this. They're trying to get him sent to prison for murdering his own best friend. But that wasn't even the extent of it. So Vadim was taken from the hospital where Andre was brought in, and he was taken to the police station. Now, he wasn't allowed to contact his mother in this time. Bear in mind, he is 14 years old. He was taken straight to the police station, put in an interrogation room, and physically beaten until police got a confession out of him, which luckily he did not give them. And I think a lot of 14-year-olds in that situation, they would be so worn down, so scared, that they probably would give a false confession. They were threatening that they were going to send him to a high-security young offenders institute if he didn't confess. They were prodding him with their batons. They were doing awful things to this boy. And eventually, when his mother did find out what was going on in this interrogation room, after hours, she threatened the police at this particular station that she would go to the public prosecutor and report them for what they were doing to her son. And in that moment, the police said, fine, he's free to go. Vadim's story stayed the same the whole entire time that he was being interrogated. He never gave in to police. He stuck with what happened that whole time. And in the weeks and months following this ordeal, Vadim had nightmares. He had such severe anxiety. He always thought that maybe those people that had killed his best friend were going to come back for him. They were going to be trying to find him this whole time. It made him not want to go outside. He didn't even go to his best friend's funeral because he was worried that the killers might see him there or something. Police probably thought with Vadim, right, well, now we've got someone to pin these murders on. He was in the area when the latest murder happened, so let's try and pin them all on this young 14-year-old boy just so that we can have an explanation, just so that we look like good police. So by now, in the case, the city was well aware that they had a serial killer on their hands. This was, the 8th victim? Police's efforts to keep it all under wraps and kind of keep it all hush-hush was not working. Word of mouth was a huge thing, especially surrounding such brutal murders. People are going to talk, people are going to warn their friends. The whole city was living in paralyzing fear at this point, and when people were talking about these serial killers, because they now knew that it was 2 people after the murder of Andre, of course they didn't have a name for the serial killers because no one knew who they were. And so through word of mouth, these serial killers gained the nickname the Dnepropetrovsk maniacs. The next victims of the maniacs appeared just 2 days later, 2 in one day this time. One was 53-year-old Nikolai Pashenko, and the other one was an unidentified male who had remained unidentified this whole time. As I've been saying through this case, a lot of these bodies were left unidentifiable, and the things that identified them were actually more like their clothing or whether they were carrying some kind of ID. It is awful, but it was only a matter of time until one of these victims didn't have anything identifying on them. Now, the next body was discovered just a few days later on July 12th, and this one is where the infamous 3 guys, 1 hammer video comes into play. This was the victim in the video. 48-year-old Sergei Yatsvenko had been missing for a few days after he'd ventured out on his motorbike one night and never came home. Sergei was a father of 2 adult sons, and one of these sons had actually had a child very recently, so he was a new grandfather, and he loved being a grandfather. He would take his grandchild out on walks. He was just a very loving, caring family man in general. He would care for his elderly mother and his 4 dogs. He had 4 dogs with his wife. He was just such a loving person with a lot of love to give. Sergei was also a very dedicated, very hardworking, very determined person. He worked hard in every job that he was given. That was just his mindset. So much so that he'd actually risked his life and almost lost his life in one of his jobs before for the sake of saving machinery for his employer. He was driving a tractor, I think along like a river, like a shallow part of a river, when it began slipping into the deeper part, and he was losing control of the tractor, and he was desperately, instead of trying to escape the tractor and swim to safety, he was trying to drive the tractor back up onto the shallow bit to save it for his employer. Sergei was eventually trapped underwater for quite some time, and he was going unconscious. They very nearly lost him, but luckily he survived, and this wasn't the only time he'd cheated death in his life. Sergei was actually left disabled after a very recent cancer diagnosis. He had a lethal tumour in his throat, which had to be removed through emergency surgery, and this surgery left him pretty much unable to talk. He was only just getting a whisper back at the time of his murder, and, you know, this kind of disability in his life led him to spend a lot more time on his motorbike. That was the only time that he felt free, like he had no responsibilities, and he was just enjoying being out in nature on his bike. Don't get me wrong, of course he loved spending time with his family, but it was now kind of frustrating for him that he can't fully communicate with them. He can only communicate through a whisper, and going out on his motorbike on an evening gave him so much freedom and happiness. And his family were, of course, very, very worried the night that he didn't come home from one of his usual bike rides. This wasn't like him. Like I said, he enjoyed being at home with his family. It wasn't like him to just go off and stay away on purpose. His wife said that night that he didn't come home, she couldn't sleep from the anxiety. She was staying up praying that she got some kind of phone call or that he was just going to come through the door. She did try filing a missing persons report. However, in the Ukraine, you have to wait at least 72 hours after a person has gone missing to file a missing persons report, you know, just in case it was a misunderstanding and they come back. It's all about saving police time. But on the reverse of that, 72 hours is a long time for people to be missing where something dangerous could be happening to them, and, you know, it's against the law to report them as missing. So all that Sergei's wife could do in those 72 hours was search for him herself. She made some missing persons posters, put pictures of him and his bike on there, describing both of them. She put these posters up all over the town. She spoke to everyone she possibly could. However, she didn't receive any phone calls or messages or anyone saying that they knew where Sergei was. That was until 4 days later. Someone called her to say that they thought they'd found Sergei's motorbike abandoned on the side of the road. So his wife went down there, she looked at this motorbike, and she confirmed that that was Sergei's. And now she knew that something was seriously wrong. Sergei wouldn't just abandon his bike on the side of a country lane as well. There was nothing nearby. So she called police to come down and have a look at the area, and they were walking into the woodland on either side of the road, and that was when they found Sergei's body. He was found about 100 meters away from his abandoned bike, and Sergei, just as with the other victims, had been brutally beaten to the head, so much so that, again, he was barely recognizable. It was all the hallmarks of the Dnepropetrovsk maniacs. It seemed like this was their next victim. The only way that Sergei's family could actually identify him was through the clothes that he was wearing. He was quite a particular guy in that he always liked to wear suits, even when he was on a motorbike. He had to be wearing a nice suit. Now, the discovery in itself was horrific enough for Sergei's family to deal with. However, they had no idea of what was to come later on when police eventually found that 3 guys, 1 hammer video. We'll get into that much later in the video. Right now, police had no idea that that existed. 2 days after Sergei's body was found, another victim was found, brutalized in the exact same way. This time, 45-year-old Natalia Mamachuk. Natalia had been riding her moped in a nearby village on the night that she was murdered. She was actually seen by 2 homeless people, a brother and sister, who actually recognised Natalia because they slept in this village every night and they often saw her. That night, they were just kind of sat on the street side and they watched Natalia as she rode past, and they weren't paying much attention to her. But then all of a sudden they heard a noise in the direction that she'd gone, so they turned to look over there and they saw Natalia laying on the ground with her moped and 2 men standing above her. The 2 siblings watched as these 2 men grabbed Natalia and dragged her into the bushes on the side of the road. And they were paralysed with fear. They kind of knew that they had to get up and do something, but they couldn't. They just watched as these 2 men had knocked this woman unconscious and dragged her into some bushes. They knew that they could easily be next. Eventually, they built up the courage to actually go over and say something. They got to the end of the road and they just shouted down to them. And within a minute or 2, the men came out of the bushes. They didn't even look at the siblings at the end of the road. They just picked up Natalia's moped, hopped on it, both of them, and drove away. The siblings tried to chase after them, but of course they were on a moped and the 2 of them were on foot, so they were never going to catch up to them. But eventually they did catch up to where Natalia's body was laying in the bushes. The siblings found a way to call the police, who arrived and recovered what was now the 12th victim of the Dnepropetrovsk maniacs. For the next 5 or 6 days, these murders continued, with police finding at least 1 mutilated body every single day, and most days it was 2. Now, I couldn't find every single one of these victims' names. I'm not sure if that's due to them remaining unidentified or if it's just a lack of public information, but I've done my best, and these victims were as follows. There was 85-year-old Regina Provenko. There was another 70-year-old woman. They went for a lot of elderly people towards the end. It seemed as though the killers were just looking for the most vulnerable people that they could find. There was a man named Nikolai Marianchikova. There was an unnamed pregnant woman whose baby was actually ripped from her body. Now, the killers, again, towards the end, they started using more weapons, not just a hammer or a blunt object. They started bringing out knives and they would stab their victims and cut their victims open. Police also occasionally found some victims with their eyes gouged out of their head, and it seemed that this had happened while they were still alive as well. And there was also another unidentified homeless man that was killed in those last 5 days. Still, with no clear motive or a victim profile, police just couldn't make sense of what was happening or why it was happening. The victims were just all so different from each other. They ranged from teenagers to old men to younger women to an army man. Although the one thing that they all seemed to have in common was that they were all vulnerable in one way or another. Or at least maybe they seemed vulnerable to the maniacs. You know, they were either young and defenseless or elderly, and so they were probably a bit physically weaker. The army man that they attacked, you would think a young man, you know, in his peak physical health would have been able to fight them off. But he was drunk. He was on his way home from a bar. It seemed as though these maniacs were going with any victim that they could find that they thought wouldn't be able to fight back. So now police had 21 murders on their hands, and potentially a whole lot more if they didn't solve this quick. Although this would be an issue because still at this point, police didn't want to make this case overly public because they didn't want to damage the reputation of the city. Dnipro was the 4th biggest city in the Ukraine, and, you know, they don't want to drive people away, they don't want to affect the economy, they don't want to affect potential tourism. I don't know if there's much tourism. They just didn't want to damage the area's reputation. But I mean, the townspeople knew. They knew there was a serial killer. Word of mouth is a thing. Police just didn't really want to put it all over the news and all over papers. They didn't want it to be worldwide news. And while they can't stop the news from reporting on it, they were keeping to themselves how brutal some of these killings were. So this meant that the police couldn't really go on the news and be like, look, we're looking for these people, they seem to be killing in this area around this time. They couldn't use the public as a tool to come forward and give them leads because they couldn't give the public any information. Instead, everything had to be done behind closed doors between the police and whoever they wanted to speak to. So for example, the police tried tracking every single victim's mobile phone if they had one, because none of them were found with their mobile phones. So it seemed as though their killers had stolen them. So they tried GPS tracking on every single phone, but none of them worked. It seemed that every single one of their phones had been switched off. So the next thing they tried was making a list of all of the things that were stolen from these victims. So jewelry, wallets, you know, the phones, everything like that, the phones that they couldn't get hold of. And they took this list of stolen items to every single pawn shop in the whole of Dnipro, hoping that maybe the killers had stolen these items from the victims and then tried to sell them at a pawn shop, and maybe that could be their link to a killer. And there were a cluster of pawn shops in one particular district of the city that claimed that they thought they had some of those missing items in their shop, that they'd bought them off of people in the past. So this narrowed it down to one particular part of the city, so police could focus in a little bit more. One of these pawn shop owners actually reported having one of the stolen phones, or he thought he had one of the stolen phones. So while he was on the phone to police telling them about this discovery that he'd made, he was switching on this phone that he'd previously bought from someone. And as he switched on this phone, police back at the station finally got a signal on one of the victim's missing phones. When the shop owner had turned it on, it had activated the GPS that police were looking for, and this confirmed that whoever had sold this phone to the pawn shop owner was probably one of the maniacs. And now, looking through the pawn shop owner's records, police finally had a name. And I'm gonna stop part 1 right there. Thank you so much for watching this video. Sorry for leaving it on a cliffhanger. You guys know I like doing that. Part 2 will be out in the next few days, hopefully, so make sure you've got my notifications on so you don't miss when that one is posted. Thanks again to Word Farmscapes for sponsoring this video. If you want to go and challenge your brain and restore a ramshackled farm, then you can click the link down below in the description and you will get a free welcome bonus when you download the game. And there's also a special offer on for this weekend only, all weekend. Play the winter quest to collect as many snowflakes as you can by completing crossword levels to win tons of amazing rewards. Don't miss this amazing opportunity to get bonus coins and win prizes. Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a big thumbs up down below. If you want to subscribe, you can click this little circle right here. And if you want to subscribe to my second channel, you can click this circle right here. And if you want to watch another video of mine, you can click this playlist right here. Okay, bye!